My guest at this time is Victor Davis Hanson. He's a senior fellow in residence at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also a professor emeritus of classics and a syndicated columnist. He is the author of many books, including a brand new one entitled The Case for Trump. And, sir, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We've heard a long list of reasons why Trump's critics think he won in 2016, the Electoral College taking precedence over the popular vote, Russian interference, Jim Comey, women voting how their husbands tell them, and on and on. You say in this book that Trump tapped into a forgotten part of the country, the white working class, and other folks have talked about this as well. But how did a real estate mogul from Manhattan accomplish this?
Well, he did it both in the message and he as the messenger. And by that I mean the latter. He was authentic and genuine. And so that was the paradox, that a Manhattan billionaire could go into Indiana or Ohio or Michigan or Pennsylvania and not change that Queen's accent in the way that Hillary adopted, a U-all patois, whether she was in Alabama, or Barack Obama would go into the inner city and sound like a rapper almost, or John Kerry would dress up in duck camouflage hunting attire. But he always wore the suit, the shoes, the long tie, the hair, the whole thing. And he talked as if he was in the Queens, whether he was at the Indiana State Fair or in rural Georgia. And people found that authentic and at least genuine. And then people forget that he at least expressed a degree of empathy when he went into West Virginia. He didn't say, as Hillary Clinton did, that if she was going to close down the coal industry, put millions of people out, thousands of people out of work. He said, I love big, beautiful coal. When he went into Michigan, he said, our workers. When he went into Iowa, he said, our farmers. When he talked about the VA, he said, our vets. And that had been lacking, to tell the truth, among prior Republican candidates. So the message, and then second, the message that free trade is not always fair, and the heartland of America is not fated to permanent deindustrialization. That's a victim in part of outsourcing, offshoring, and Chinese mercantilism, and that all existential wars, while existential wars are necessary, maybe not optional wars that do not translate tactical battlefield victories into strategic advantages like Syria or Libya or Afghanistan or Iraq. And then finally, you can't have a sovereign country, and a sovereign country is essential for the existence of its people unless you have a secure border. And for some reason, the regular Democratic and Republican candidates alike had ignored that. And there was a geographical element to that. And the election was not going to be decided by 51% of the popular vote or states in the Electoral College like California and Texas, but about 9 or 10 purple states in the so-called swing areas of the Middle West.
Right, and he ended up winning states, 3 of which I don't think had been red since the 1980s, with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But in addition to Trump ringing authentic to a lot of these voters, they really didn't have much patience, you write, with the existing political class. So in other words, they were desperately looking for someone they could identify as authentic compared to the folks they had already seen, whether it's folks who had been around a long time or folks who had been around a relatively recent time, like Rubio and Cruz. And that seemed to carry over to the general election, where Hillary Clinton was seen as the entrenched political person. So at what point did so many people just get fed up and give a giant political middle finger to the political class?
I think a lot of it started in 2008 with the Obama ascendancy. I think when John McCain kind of sanctimoniously said, I'm going to rule out Reverend Wright as a campaign issue, even though he said these terrible things about the United States, and he was Obama's personal confidant pastor. They didn't like that. And they didn't like when Mitt Romney in that second debate didn't challenge Candy Crawley, who was the moderator, and basically tried to give it over to Obama in a very unprofessional manner. Those were just emblematic of the idea that people said, why in the world should I go out and support a conservative candidate when at any given moment he might turn on me and say that I'm a wacko bird or a crazy or use the terminology that the left does of a clinger or deplorable. And so they were tired of getting out in front of the Republican establishment. And then when they looked at the Republican establishment, often if it was Jeb Bush, he said illegal immigration was an act of love, or Marco Rubio or John McCain said they were sort of scared of the Tea Party, even though they had been beneficiaries of them. And so a lot of people said, you know what, I don't think there's much difference. George Bush doubled the debt, so did Marco Rubio. Employers of the Republican Party constituencies want open borders as much as ethnic activists. A lot of our people in finance and high tech are just as eager to cut deals with China that allow them to appropriate critical technology. And they felt, I don't really see the difference between a Mitt Romney and a Hillary Clinton. They seem to have the same taste, interest, and constituencies and people around them. And that also explains, as I said in the book, why people hate Trump so much, because he doesn't have that loyalty or affinity or even respect for the Brookings Institution or the Council on Foreign Relations or the World Bank or the NATO hierarchy.
Well, how do you read Trump and what he could be at this point? Because I think a lot of folks, if they look mostly at policy, there is quite a debate in the party over tariffs and some of the things that he's doing. But most of the controversies over his personality and maybe some actions like the national emergency declaration and so forth. But he's largely pursued, as you point in the book, what he promised to do on the campaign trail, perhaps more than any recent Republican nominee or any president in the last generation or so. You look at getting out of the Iran deal, the climate deal, the embassy in Israel, the tax cuts, and so forth. But if Donald Trump conducted himself, maybe not inauthentically, but a little more maturely, whether it's on Twitter or in his public comments, would this be a guy at 55% or even higher? Or are we just in such a polarized atmosphere now that even if he did behave himself, as we might phrase it, he'd still be almost as controversial?
Well, that's certainly the conventional wisdom, and I think sometimes I fall into it. But it's also, we've got to contextualize it in the fact that we have the Shorenstein Center, to take one example, at Harvard University, showing us through their analytics that 85 to 90% of all press coverage is negative Donald Trump. And that predated his presidential actual tenure. And then we've never seen assassination chic like, Madonna or Johnny Depp or Snoop Dogg or Kathy Griffin bind with each other to tell the public they'd like to shoot him, blow him up, behead him, engulf him in flame. We've never seen a president face the Mueller investigation, this McCabe Palace coup, 25th Amendment, Logan Act, Emoluments Act, vote to sue on the voting machines, invoke impeachment right out of the gate. So I guess he would say to us, whether I like it, you like me or not, they were always never going to give me credit for 3% annualized growth or near record peacetime unemployment. And I don't have access to any other venue other than a little bit in social media, maybe Fox News and talk radio. And they have the foundations, they have professional sports, they have entertainment, they've got the major newspapers, they've got the public venues, PBS, NPR, and they have the foundations. They surely have the universities. And no matter what I was going to do, I did that. So what he does is he tries to retaliate. He usually doesn't start these feuds that are controversial. He didn't start calling Kellyanne Conway's husband started calling him names. Even John McCain started the feud when he called his supporters crazy. And then he overreacts, or maybe he creates deterrence by retaliating. And then in that conundrum and emotion and anger and furor, usually the person who gets in a ring with Donald Trump, who after all was in a physical wrestling ring in his earlier incarnation of his career, doesn't do as well. And then people are less likely to want to bait him. I think that's the theory behind it. And I think about half the country says he's an SOB maybe, but he's our SOB, or I don't want to play by the Marquess of Queensberry rules because we lost 5 out of the 6 popular votes in the presidential election, or we haven't won 51%. since 1988 when George H.W. Bush did it, and he only did it because Lee Atwater was sort of the prior incarnation of Donald Trump, his campaign manager. So they're saying, no more Marcus of Queensberry rules, no more politeness. I want to have a war room like Clinton did. I want to take a gun to a knife fight or get in their faces the way Obama promised. And I think that's what at least they thought they wanted with Trump. And like every gunslinger in the proverbial Western, as I wrote in the book, whether it's Shane or a Magnificent Seven, once they start to bring results, that gives us all the luxury or the margin to say, you know what, I like what he's doing. He's getting rid of the cattle barons. He's getting rid of the bandits. But I don't know. He seems to be too familiar or too comfortable with rough speech or comportment.
What do you make of opinion polls? A lot of folks were surprised on Election Day because Hillary Clinton was ahead in the national polls and a lot of the state polls that Trump ended up winning. And you mentioned in the book that a lot of folks don't necessarily give their honest opinion because perhaps of the overwhelming negative media coverage, what their friends might think of them. You mentioned that as well, that they're reluctant to even privately, much less publicly, admit support for Trump. So as we head into 2020, how reliable are these numbers going to be given how folks really think and what they're willing to say can diverge quite a bit?
I think there's still a 3 to 4% underreporting, and I think it depends on whether it's a daily tracking poll where a person in his own home pushes a button on a computer of a pre-selected group versus even answering a phone call. People are reluctant to voice that to a person they don't know on the other end. So the USC daily tracking poll, the Investors Business Daily tracking poll were the ones that were most accurate. Rasmussen was accurate in the last election, so I trust them more. I also think that tendency is with us. I was just on a flight coming back to California, and a man looked at me and said, "Are you the one that wrote this book?" And he pulled out from the seat the Case for Trump that has the picture on it. I signed it at his request, and then he put it back onto the seat. And I kind of laughed and I asked him why. And he said, "It's like wearing a red MAGA hat. You'd have to be stupid walking around with this book in an airport or a plane," because he didn't want to get public criticism. But yet that didn't mean he was not going to vote for Trump. So there's a lot of people who feel that Trump is sort of like chemotherapy, and we have a cancer. We're the host. Chemotherapy makes the host ill, but it kills the cancer first. That's their attitude, at least as I wrote about. And I think those tendencies are still there. And then finally, you don't run in a vacuum. He ran in 2016 against Hillary Clinton that had a lot of negatives. And her negatives sort of they overplayed, or what's the word, they nullified many of Trump's negatives. But in 2020, same is going to be true. He's going to be running, whether the Democrats and the progressives and the left knows it, he's going to be running against reparations, the new Green Deal, near infanticide, a wealth tax, a 90% income tax rate, abolishing ICE, abolishing student debt, abolishing the Electoral College, Medicare for everybody. I don't think those individual issues poll 51%. And yet he's going to say it's all of that versus 3% annualized growth, below 4% peacetime unemployment, record gas and oil production, restoration of deterrence abroad, and me, Donald Trump, standing between you and Bernie Sanders and maybe or Kamala Harris and socialism. And so that's what we're looking at. And people didn't realize that in 2016 they were so focused on Trump's foibles and his comportment, they didn't realize that you don't vote in a popularity contest. You vote against a good candidate or a better candidate or a bad candidate and a worse candidate. It's always a Manichaean choice.
And so it sounds like you believe that the Democratic lurch to the left might be Trump's greatest asset heading into 2020.
Yeah, I think so. I saw it as a young person in 1972 with Georgia McGovern. I saw it in my 30s in 1984 when they went to full Mondale. The Democrats did. I saw it as a little kid, 11 years old when the Republicans went Goldwater in 64. And my point is that when ideology absorbs a party, they get into a revolutionary cycle where each candidate tries to outdo not only his opponent in becoming more purely left-wing in the case of the Democrats, but his own prior incarnation. So we now see Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Kristen Gilbert, they're apologizing for the prior centrist or even liberal positions. And where this goes, it's sort of like the French Revolution. It's all the way to the Jacobins and the guillotine. Nobody can be revolutionarily pure enough. And so Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are in a party where they each claim that they're the front runners, but they're representing a party that really has said we were tired of old white men and that you're overrepresented. And how do you square that circle? I don't know how you do it. And even for socialists like Bernie Sanders. So they're going to have a lot of rendezvous in the 2020. And I think if Trump can, maintain a good economy and stay out of an optional and unpopular war and avoid the Mueller investigations, then I think he's got a 55, 60% chance of getting reelected. What usually sinks an incumbent either drops his popularity or makes him not be reelected. It's something that destroyed Bush's popularity, the Iraq War or the Nixon Watergate scandal or the George H.W. Bush so-called serious recession of 1992.
Lastly, Professor Hanson, this is a big one, too, and you spend a lot of time in the book on it, but a lot of folks either don't have the time or they get lost in the details and all the different unravelings that happen with the entrenched bureaucracy in this country. You write a lot about it in this book and the adversarial relationship they have with Trump, whether it's when he was running or since he's taken office. But if you mention deep state, folks start to glaze over. If you start to connect the dots, you lose them. So what's provable at this point about efforts to stop Trump before Election Day 2016 and since then?
Well, we know, and it's not a point of disagreement, that Hillary Clinton, through her Perkins Coie friends in the DNC, hired a foreign national, Christopher Steele, to compile dirt through paying for Russian sources. Some of them he just took off the internet, though, and then take that dossier with smears and slanders that were unverified and do two things with it. Give it to people in the State Department and people like CIA Director John Brennan to seed throughout government, and give it to the media like David Corn and Michael Iskoff before the election, or to go to a FISA court and not tell the justice that this opposition research was in fact paid for by Hillary Clinton, was unverified, and its author had been severed from FBI service, contractual service, because of his untruthfulness. And then the circular news accounts that you presented to the court as proof were based on, in circular fashion, on this dossier. And then after the election, of course, more FISA efforts to spy on Trump associates, Michael Flynn, etc., and basically try to use the powers of the deep state. I mean, CIA director, FBI director, FBI associate, DOJ, top officials, Bruce Orr, whose wife worked on it, first to sabotage the campaign and then to nullify the verdict. And then what Trump was especially angry at, I think he had good cause, is there's not an equality or an equal applicability of the law. So that what I mean by that is Michael Flynn is facing prison time for mixing up his stories, or they at least are not consistent according to the FBI and the DOJ and Mr. Mueller. But we know that John Brennan has admitted to lying under oath to Congress. James Clapper has admitted to lying under oath to Congress. Andrew McCabe has been cited by the Inspector General of lying under oath. James Comey on 245 times said he couldn't remember or didn't know while under oath. I could go on. I think we have 20 DOJ or FBI officials now that have resigned, been reassigned, retired, et cetera, have been fired. And I guess what I'm getting at is that the public says, well, where's the prison sentence? Well, where's the trial? Where's the indictment? They don't see any of that. And yet lives have been ruined in association with the charge of Russian collusion. And that's what they don't like. And I think Trump's facing a Nietzschean moment where anything that doesn't kill him is going to, in the eyes of voters, make him stronger, because he gets up every morning, he hears that his wife did this, his son did this, his teenager's kid is this, or he allegedly did this or did that. And most of the time, those charges are not true or they're not verifiable. So people say, Logan Act, okay, Emoluments Act, okay, 25th Amendment, okay, sue for the voting machines, okay, Mueller, okay, McCabe trying and Rosenstein trying to, I don't know what, okay, suing in the Ninth Circuit, okay, but at some point, let's just let the guy finish and see what his record is, and then we'll adjudicate that in 2020. So they're overreaching, and you can see in the polls that people who believe the Mueller investigation is a witch hunt is now a majority of American citizens. That's a damning index for what people said was, at one time was the dream team or the all-star team of these progressive lawyers who were going to destroy Donald Trump for his sins of collusion.
Professor Hanson, it's a fascinating read, and for anyone who wants to really dig into the Trump phenomenon and understand how it happened, the case for Trump is certainly a great resource. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you.
Victor Davis Hanson, Senior Fellow in Residence at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, Professor Emeritus of Classics, and a syndicated columnist. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.